take it to these new lands. And so we see great saints like St. Francis Xavier, who helped found the Society of Jesus with Ignatius, go off to the far world, go off to the Far East, and to bring the gospel to Japan, and also wanted to bring it to China right before his death. He died right off the coast of China, trying to bring the gospel to China. Could we just imagine for a moment if St. Francis Xavier had been successful in missioning the gospel in China, how different our world would be today, how different China would be today. Again, it wasn't to be. It wasn't part of the story. That part of the Catholic Church's story is yet to be told in terms of trying to establish firmly the gospel in China, although the Catholic Church exists underground and continues to try to bring the light of Christ to a society that desperately needs the light of Christ in our modern world. So these Jesuits were kind of like the special operations troops of the 17th and 16th and 17th century. They were the ones who would go behind enemy lines. They would go to Protestant areas and they'd spread the faith. They were sent to England, where again, remember, if you were a Jesuit in England and you were caught, you could immediately be executed. And so there was great danger that these Jesuits adopted, but they became the shock troops of the Church and of the Holy Father in particular, to go forth and to spread the gospel and to bring people who had left the faith back to the faith during this period of the Catholic Reformation. Now we change our story, we look at a different aspect of our story now, and we move away from the Reform, and we have to see what's also going on in the later part of the 16th century concerning Islam. We've talked about Islam throughout our time together, and how Islam arose in the 7th century, conquered those ancient Christian lands, that the faith then responded, the Church responded to Islam's push on the Byzantine Empire with the calling of the Crusades. Well, now in the 16th century, we've seen the growth of not a new form of Islam, but a new group of Muslims come into the picture, and they are called the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans begin to then maraud through in the 16th century, 17th century, they begin to maraud through the Mediterranean, and they actually also push their way into Eastern Europe, and even to the gateway of Europe, to Vienna, which we'll talk about at the end of this session. So the Ottomans are very influential. They are building a large fleet at this time in 1571 to go and attack Rome. The Ottoman Sultan at this time is Selim II, and he prepares this large fleet to go and attack Rome. He actually referred to Rome as the Red Apple. And he referred to it as the Red Apple because he saw it was nice, big, and juicy, and ripe for the plucking, ripe for the taking. And so this whole objective that the Ottomans had to conquer Rome was not a new objective of Islam, and it's still, in some sense, an objective of Islam today. Just recently, in 2008, a member of Hamas said this about Rome: "Very soon, Allah willing, Rome will be conquered just like Constantinople. Today, Rome is the capital of the Catholics, or the Crusader capital, which has declared its hostility to Islam, and has planted the brothers of apes and pigs," meaning the Jews, in Palestine, in order to prevent the reawakening of Islam. This capital of theirs will be an advanced post for the Islamic conquests, which will spread through Europe in its entirety, and then will turn to the two Americas and even Eastern Europe. So this was not said in the 16th century, this was said in the 21st century. This objective of Islam trying to conquer Rome is not an end, my friends. It continues in certain circles of Islam still today. So how did the Church address, and how did Western Europe address this growing Ottoman Turkish threat in the latter part of the 16th century? Well, it was through the efforts of Pope St. Pius V, whom we talked about with his reform decrees from the Council of Trent, or the implementing of the reform decrees from the Council of Trent. Pope St. Pius V saw this Turkish threat growing, and so he formed the Holy League. And the Holy League was an alliance between the Papal States, Venice, and the Kingdom of Spain. And so this Holy League was going to construct and build a fleet to go and attack the Turkish fleet that was bent on the conquest of Rome. Pius V put at the head of this fleet Don Juan of Austria. Don Juan of Austria was a 24-year-old illegitimate son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So he was half-brother to Philip II, King of Spain. He was a very young man, but an able military commander, as we'll see when we talk about the battle. The Turks presented a very great fleet, a numerous fleet. They were in the confines of the Gulf of Lepanto, and they had 300 war galleys and in their fleet with over 100,000 men and some fierce soldiers known as janissaries as well in this fleet. So they were bent on the conquest of Rome. Also in this Turkish fleet were 14,000 Christian galley slaves. So the way to picture warfare, naval warfare at this time is, if you've seen the movie Ben-Hur, and you know Ben-Hur is shackled at the bottom of a Roman ship and he's rowing, and they have that infamous scene in the battle where they engage. Basically, that's what naval warfare was still like here in the 16th century. You had these wooden ships with a main mast that had a sail to it, so if you had the wind in your favor, you could use your sail to power the ship. And then you could let all of the galley slaves below deck come up on top of deck, and they could fight once you got alongside an enemy ship. Because the whole idea for these galleys was to come along each other, and then they would throw grappling hooks to the other ship, lash the ships together, and then the men on deck would flow over to the enemy ship and try to capture the enemy ship. So the Turks had these 14,000 Christian galley slaves down below decks rowing the ships into battle. If you have the wind in your favor, then you can release those galley slaves up on deck. If you don't have the wind in your favor, then you have to keep them below deck to row to propel your ship. So that's important because it all comes into play what happens here at the Battle of Lepanto. The Christian fleet was less numerous than the Turkish fleet, only 200 war galleys. Interestingly though, every man, both slave and free in the Christian fleet, was given a rosary before the fleet sailed. A papal representative was also near the fleet at her port when she sailed and blessed the fleet as she left to engage in this battle. Chaplains also were present throughout the fleet. Dominicans, Franciscans, and Jesuits were scattered throughout the fleet in order to encourage and bless the men and hear their confessions before they went into battle. One important and interesting character who participated in the Battle of Lepanto becomes famous later for a work that he wrote known as Don Quixote. So Miguel Cervantes actually participated in the Battle of Lepanto, fought very bravely, and was even wounded during it. The two fleets met in the Gulf of Lepanto on Sunday, October 7th, 1571. The Turkish fleet was aligned in the form of a crescent. This was how they actually always fought their battles in order to envelop and inflank the opposing enemy fleet. Don Juan of Austria decided that he would arrange his ships in the form of a cross. And so literally, at the Battle of Lepanto, you had the cross and the crescent fighting one another. And the reason why Don Juan had put his ships in the form of a cross was because he had some secret weapons. He had a secret weapon that he had developed. What he did with some of his galleys is he outfitted his galleys with side-mounted cannon instead of forward-mounted cannon. Most galleys at this time only had cannons in the bow, not on the side. So he took a few of his galleys, had these side-mounted cannons, and put them on the transept of the actual cross. So if they were lined up this way, as the Turkish ships came at them, they could fire this broadside shot against the Turkish fleet and decimate them. He also put musketeers on top of the deck in order to fire volleys into the Turkish ships when they got close. So he really actually changed the tactics of naval warfare with this Battle of Lepanto. He also had at his disposal another secret weapon. It was a spiritual weapon. And this spiritual weapon was an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, was present on the ships. The Bishop of Mexico at the time had produced a small reproduction of the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, touched it to the original, and then sent it to King Philip II of Spain with instructions to make sure it was present in the fleet. King Philip of Spain gave this image to Admiral Doria, who was in the midst of the battle. He had the image on his ship, and the wind changed during an important moment in the battle. Remember how I said that if you had the wind against you, which the Christian fleet did at the time in the battle at this moment, you had to have all of your galley slaves or rowers down below decks rowing to propel the ship. But if the wind changed, and now you have the wind in your favor and you have the sail, you can release them all up to deck to fight. And that's exactly what happened here present at this moment in the battle when Admiral Doria's flagship, with the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe on it, the wind changed. He was able to release his sailors from below decks, fight the Turks, and win an overwhelming victory. The Christian fleet, although outnumbered, won a great victory that day on Sunday, October 7th, 1571. They captured and destroyed over 200 Turkish war galleys. The Turks suffered 30,000 casualties, and 12,000 of those 14,000 Christian galley slaves were freed. The Christians lost a total of only 12 galleys. It was an amazing, almost miraculous victory that day towards the end of the 16th century. As a result, they're actually during the battle, towards the end of the battle, after the battle had been won, St. Pius V in Rome, back in Rome, had no news of the battle but he was meeting with his treasurer. All of a sudden, he got up, walked to the window, and said this: "This is not a moment for business. Make haste to thank God, because our fleet this moment has won a victory over the Turks." So he had a miraculous knowledge that the battle had been won. And so he called for a great celebration to take place, and the news eventually reached Rome later that the Christian fleet had won this victory. A year after the victory, in 1572, he ordered an annual commemoration of the event under the title of Our Lady of Victory. And then a year after that, Gregory XIII, the new pope, changed the name of that feast day from Our Lady of Victory to Our Lady of the Rosary, giving credit to Our Lady and the Rosary for giving the Christians this great victory over Islam. And it's a feast day that we still celebrate in the church today. Every October 7th is the feast of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, and it commemorates this great battle in the 16th century. This battle actually marked the turning point for Islamic conquests in the Mediterranean. Islam was never again able to mount an effective naval threat to Europe in the rest of her history. She would, however, continue to present a threat over land, as she would make excursions into Eastern Europe, and again all the way up until the gateway of Europe of Vienna, which we'll talk about at the end of our session here. So we had this great battle, this great victory over Islam, and we left before we talked about the Battle of Lepanto, we were discussing the reform of the church and how that came about. And I said how that the reform of the church was implemented through the activities and the actions of St. Pius V, through the Jesuits, and also through holy saints. And so now we take time to look at some of these holy saints that helped bring about the authentic Catholic Reformation. And really these saints can be divided into three categories: mystics, missionaries, and martyrs. There were mystics, saints such as St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, who brought a reform to their respective religious orders, and then through the reform of their orders then began also a reform of the church. We see also great missionaries, which we'll talk about, and martyrs, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of St. Teresa of Avila, she's a great doctor of the church, a wonderful, brilliant woman who had a deep relationship with the Lord. In 1562, she reformed the Carmelite order, creating what is known now as the Discalced Carmelite order, of those who go without shoes. She reformed convents all throughout Spain and was a great mystical writer, writing such works as The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle. A contemporary of her on the male side of the house was St. John of the Cross. He reformed the Carmelite order for men, also a doctor of the church for his great mystical writings. He wrote such works as The Dark Night of the Soul, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, and The Living Flame of Love. These works that are still revered and read now in our modern day in the church. So not only did they affect and bring about a reform in the 16th century in the life of the church, but they continue through their efforts to bring about reform of everyday Christians who take up these works and read them. There was another saint who really embodied and made it his mission in his life to embody the Reformed decrees of Trent, and this is the great St. Charles Borromeo. St. Charles Borromeo was actually Pope Pius IV's nephew and personal secretary. He then appointed the Archbishop of Milan at a very young age, the age of 21. But despite his young age, he was a man very devoted to the church, very devoted to the faith, and wanted to bring about the reforms of Trent. He actually did play an important role in the Council of Trent by sending numerous letters to the council fathers who were meeting. He never actually went to the council himself in person, but he wrote letters to those who were in attendance and helped to bring about the reform of the church through his letter writing. He went to Milan in 1565 to take up residence as the Archbishop, and as I mentioned in an earlier session, Milan had gone through a time of almost a century where it did not have a resident archbishop. This was, remember, the abuse we talked about of absenteeism, where bishops weren't actually present and living in their diocese. So St. Charles wanted to go and live in Milan so that people could see their archbishop and he could be the force, a personal force of bringing about the reform of Trent to his city and to his archdiocese. He died at the very young age of 46 after spending his life devoted to bringing about the reform of the church in his diocese, but also throughout the whole entire church. We also have at this time in the 16th century a great saint in Rome, known as the apostle to the Romans, really, Saint Philip Neri. Saint Philip Neri founds the congregation of the Oratorians, where he exhorts priests to live together, secular priests, to live together in common in community to support and strengthen one another in living out their holy vocation. He was a reformer of souls, really through personal example. He lived a very simple, holy life, spent a lot of time in the confessional trying to minister to penitents and to reform the life of the church through the use of that great, wonderful sacrament. He also walked throughout the city of Rome preaching and exhorting people to return to God and return to the church and return to a life in imitation of Christ. We have another great saint at this moment who is really known as the missionary to the Calvinists, and this is St. Francis de Sales. St. Francis de Sales volunteered to work as a priest in the area of Geneva. Remember how in our last time period of Protesters and Defenders we talked about Geneva and the type of life and the theocracy that John Calvin established in that city. So he went to Geneva in the area, and he went back to minister to these people who had gone over to Calvinism and to bring them back into the light of the authentic church. He was made Bishop of Geneva in 1602. He wrote many works, pamphlets, books, and tracts explaining the faith so that people would know the authentic teaching of the church and not necessarily be given in to Protestant rhetoric or Protestant false teaching. He provided catechetical instruction for people, had a great love for the poor, a very holy man who lived an austere and simple life, and who at the time gave people, not only at the time, but also gives us today, a work that we can use to grow in our faith. His work called The Introduction to the Devout Life, a way of reading this work and of growing closer to Christ and following his example and following the procedures he lays out for us to grow closer to Christ and his church. He brought thousands of Protestants who had given in to the Protestant heresy back to the church. A great, holy, wonderful man. So we see, this is why we've colored this time period of the Catholic Reformation gold, because of the holy saints who were just so active and so prevalent during this time. So we have our mystics, and now we have our missionaries as well with St. Francis de Sales. We have other missionaries, a Jesuit known as St. Peter Canisius, who goes to Germany and he's known as the second apostle of Germany. As the first apostle of Germany is St. Boniface, who we talked about in our time period of missionaries, and the emperor. He's known as a doctor of the catechism because he writes a catechism, a local catechism, to help German Protestants come back to the faith, to know the authentic teaching of the church. And so when we come back from our break, we'll continue our discussion of these holy saints, these missionaries, and who went on and spread the faith throughout the world during this period of the authentic Catholic Reformation. We'll be back after this break. To Epic, a journey through church history. So we take 20 sessions to go through the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. We're on our session on a time period of the Catholic Reformation, where we're going through and discussing how the Church actually authentically reformed herself in response to the Protestant Revolution. And before our break, we looked at the role of great and many saints, holy saints, that the Holy Spirit brought to the Church during this time in order to help reform the Church in response to Protestantism. And so we saw how these saints really can be classified into three groups: mystics, missionaries, and martyrs. And so we talked about our mystics with St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila, and how they brought about a reform of the religious life, in particular in Spain, through the Carmelite order. And then we talked about some missionary saints, St. Francis de Sales, who went and became a sort of a missionary priest really in Protestant country around Geneva in Switzerland. We talked about St. Philip Neri, who missioned not in Protestant country, but missioned at the heart of the church in Rome, where he tried to bring about a renewal and a reform of the life of the clergy in Rome itself. And we talked too about St. Peter Canisius, a Jesuit, who went to Germany and helped, especially those Protestant regions of northern Germany, in order to bring the faith to the Protestants and the Lutherans there and to bring them back into the church. And so we stopped there with the missionary efforts of St. Peter Canisius, and now we look at St. Francis Xavier, who we mentioned briefly in our last session, and how he was one of the original founders of the Jesuit order with St. Ignatius of Loyola. And he went far beyond the reaches of the gospel. He went to the other side of the world, really, to spread the gospel and to bring about an evangelization of peoples. He went to India and to New Guinea. He went to the Philippines and Japan. And as I mentioned, he died off the coast of China. While he was in Japan, though, he made great efforts and great strides spreading the gospel in that island nation. He was a proponent of native clergy.